Welcome back to the Yarning Circle podcast. I'm Claire and today I'm going to be chatting with Gidget.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about the topic of language, the role Indigenous languages play for individuals and communities, the variety of language experiences across the country, and how Indigenous language revival and renewal programs fit into current education frameworks. I'd first like to make a disclaimer that this episode includes two non-Indigenous women speaking about topics concerning Indigenous Australians. We will not attempt to speak for or over Indigenous voices, and we encourage listeners to follow up this episode by listening to and reading the perspectives of Indigenous people.
For our listeners out there who don't really have much of a background or knowledge about this area, Claire, can you give us some information about language revival, like a background to it?
Yeah, so before colonisation, there were around 250 unique Indigenous languages spoken by Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, with it being very common for individuals to often speak many languages as well.
Because, like, before colonisation, there was lots of, like, little clans, I suppose. Like, it depends on, like, the area, but I usually assume they're called clans. So that's obviously different clans had different languages. Is that what you're saying here?
So they needed to communicate between them, obviously. But when it's 250, it's not variations of the same language, it's 250 unique languages. The differences between what's spoken in Northern Australia versus down in Victoria would have been completely different, and they wouldn't have been able to communicate with each other at all.
Almost like different languages, like, around the country.
But since then, many languages have been completely lost, and only around 120 remain today. That being said, only around 13 are considered to be strong, and the rest are considered at high risk of being no longer spoken or being considered sleeping, with no speakers being left. But today, even the languages spoken by thousands of people are still considered endangered or at risk.
So what caused so many languages to stop being spoken?
So the strongest way that language is transmitted is intergenerationally.
And so, like, what does intergenerationally mean in this kind of context?
So the way that language is passed along is through languages and communities. So it's passed down to children that way, in the same way we learn English.
Yeah.
But when a child is removed from their family, which has been happening since colonisation.
Still happening?
Yeah, still happening. So through government policy, it has become institutionalised that children can be easily removed from their families, and the links that are required for language to be passed on are broken.
Yeah, okay.
So some people may say that English is enough. Why do we need to revive Indigenous languages? But that's sort of off the presumption that the only role of language is to communicate, whereas the role of Indigenous languages is deeply ingrained in well-being, in mental health, cultural well-being, and connection to culture and land. So oftentimes something that we don't really think about is the way that the language we speak affects our mindset. So in our case, English gives us a certain perspective on the world based on the vocabulary that's provided for us to describe the world we live in.
Yeah, and so obviously, like, most of the words we use are English words, and they're based in Eurocentric models. So everything in our world is Eurocentric, essentially, in Australia now.
Yeah. So the thing that Indigenous languages provide is obviously different perspectives, but perspectives that have been built over tens of thousands of years on this land, specific to the community that speaks that language. So there's a lot of things that you can't translate from an Indigenous language into English, in the same way us summarising something like dreaming or dream time does not accurately portray what that means to an Indigenous person or in Indigenous language.
Yeah.
So I wanted to include a quote from Amelia Turner, an Indigenous woman, about what language means to her. So she says, "Our language is sacred. Words are given to us by the land, and those words are sacred. Words make things happen, make us alive. Words come not only from our land, but also from our ancestors. Language is what we see in people. Language is what we know of people. Language is how people identify themselves. Being you is to know your language. It is rooted in your relationship from creation, in your kinship that cycles from then and there, onwards and onwards." So I think that quote really illustrates the complicated and important role that languages play in Indigenous culture, and how as English speakers we don't always realise the complexity of something like the relationship that an Indigenous person has with their language.
Yeah, I guess a lot of what I've seen is kind of things aren't targeted to look specifically at not communities as such, but areas. So like looking at specific remote areas, and then like looking at some regional areas, like for Shepparton per se, like Yorta Yorta, the targeted language programs are going to be really different to obviously not regional, remote areas like in the Northern Territory. So things need to be specialized, especially for like for different areas.
Yeah, especially it's an important act of reconciliation to have Indigenous voices at the forefront of developing these programs, because around the country, every language group has different needs in their programs.
Yeah.
So an important aspect of all of this is bringing Indigenous culture and language into the framework of education systems that we have established. So for a lot of children, if they speak an Indigenous language at home, especially in more Northern Australia, coming to school, oftentimes it's alienating to only have English. So for them, having programs in their language helps them. In the same way in Victoria, for English-speaking Indigenous people, especially in programs I've looked at out in Healesville Way or down Gippsland Way, it brings the child's culture into the classroom and makes them have a place and feel identity in the classroom when their language from their area is taught in the classroom to Indigenous and non-Indigenous children.
Yeah. So do you think it needs to be changed at a curriculum level, or even just like what do you see as like the most important thing to get this starting to happen?
So I think the most important thing is the nuanced needs, as we were talking about before, of each Indigenous language group. So an issue with putting it into a curriculum is a lot of times you're generalizing and simplifying something that's like so complicated and important. And especially with the language ecology of a community, especially in Victoria, for example, they need elders in their community to come into the school to teach the language.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult thing to say curriculum throughout the entire state when each Indigenous language group is different. And even in Victoria, there's several different language groups that are all part of an organisation that promote Indigenous language, but it's difficult to put it across the board, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and make it like a fundamental thing that they have to tick a box of kind of thing, because that's just not how it's going to work. Right?
Yeah. So in your education, did you come across Indigenous languages that was taught to you through your curriculum?
Growing up in Shepparton, which is Yorta Yorta, I was exposed to some of it, but it seemed like our school focused more on teaching Indigenous kids about Indigenous culture and language more so than the general, like all the kids, which obviously like you've talked about in this podcast, like that is part of making cultural revival stronger, is like including everyone in it. So everyone gets of Indigenous culture and knowledges and perspectives, and like you said, it's all tied, it's all intertwined.
A lot of what I've realised through my personal experience through school was a lot of what I learned about Indigenous culture was put in the past. And it wasn't presented to me in a way where it was a culture that is ongoing, evolving and alive, just in the way any culture is.
Yeah.
And I think this is an important distinction to make. Even in a lot of the readings I was doing this semester talking about Indigenous language, they use the word preservation often to describe a program, whereas it wasn't until I read a report written by Indigenous authors that I came across the words of language revival and renewal to describe what these programs do. So it isn't the idea of a dead language being preserved, but if a language isn't spoken much anymore, it's a sleeping language that is being reawakened or renewed.
It's funny how like even in the research language that you've done, it's just so wrong almost.
So in this process of renewal and revival, a lot of important things to consider is the process that it takes in the teaching of an Indigenous language versus something that we're familiar with, like French or Japanese or a second language in primary school, for example. So in teaching a second language like French or Japanese, for example, we learn simple phrases and things that would equip us if we went overseas to speak to someone who speaks that language. And a lot of what happens then is we start with the language and the culture comes second. So once you've been learning Japanese for a few years, for example, you learn culture over that time. But the opposite is true when we're talking about Indigenous language. So culture is so embedded in the language that you can't isolate language from culture.
Yeah.
So it's a different process, and it's a different way of thinking about teaching, which has a more, the word holistic isn't the best to use, but a more holistic approach.
Yeah.
Where you're not just talking about words or vocabulary. I mean, that is an aspect of it, but there's also culture that comes as a prerequisite that you start learning about the second you start learning the language.
And that has like such obviously importance and meaning behind all of the words that you learn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's so important to have that link of culture in education and curriculum and like classrooms, because it teaches kids to be more culturally competent to the knowledges and perspectives that Indigenous histories and present like culture has, and the importance of understanding that it's still current and it's still, this is so bad to say, but like alive, instead of it being part of our past.
Yeah, it's definitely relevant, and I think a lot of Australians, especially our age and older, missed out on that in their education and aren't competent in understanding the first thing about Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous culture that isn't just about what we know in pop culture about Indigenous people. It's so much deeper than that. And when it's like philosophical like perspectives that are different from ours, that like we get through our mainstream education or anything like that, it's just so important, especially after we've taken Indigenous Studies units at university, to encourage especially the listeners that are listening to go out there and listen to Indigenous voices and take the time to understand perspectives that are different from what we're taught growing up.
Yeah, especially like as non-Indigenous women, like we don't, like we're not the summoning voice here. Like we're just a background voice coming in to like obviously like give you some of our perspective on some of the research that we've done essentially.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for anyone wanting to go out and get a little bit more information about this?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about language specifically, I definitely recommend the National Indigenous Languages Report, which was published very recently, which is a report put together by Indigenous authors and organisations that really detail but also break down into simple infographics stuff that we misperceive about Indigenous languages and culture and how important it is.
Yeah.
I'd also recommend just to go out there and listen to Indigenous voices when it comes to issues about Indigenous people, which may seem like an obvious thing.
But it's simple, but it's really important.
Yeah, like going to the source and listening to what Indigenous communities actually demand when they want change, instead of what the media or the government like promotes as what something is. I think it just takes a bit of work or a bit of extra work just to take the time to read and listen to Indigenous voices, because as allies in issues that concern Indigenous people, we need to take the time to listen to them.
Yeah, super simple, but like even just following people on Instagram, it just introduces like a whole new perspective onto your feed, which is something sounds so stupid, but like it's really important. Yeah,
and it's the same with any issue that we talk about in our podcast series. A lot of stuff flies under the radar. Yeah. Especially if we're talking about deaths in custody, if we're talking about incarceration, if we're talking about constitutional change, all of this stuff is barely covered or boiled down into simple things that just aren't representative of the true issues.
And also don't represent everyone's views, because you've got to remember, like, everyone has different views on this. All Indigenous people have different views. We can't just watch one media statement and be like, okay, well, that's what every Indigenous person thinks, because that's a lie.
Especially with our education when we were growing up, the curriculum lacked a lot. And I think, especially as we're older, it's now up to us to take the time to be well-informed and have a well-rounded view about things.
Yeah, and that's why you guys are listening today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Yarning Circle podcast. I'd like to thank Gidget for joining me for my episode.
Pleasure.
And make sure to tune in to learn more about the evolving issues and demands faced by Indigenous Australians in the next episode.